With their cold blood, bony scales, beady eyes, and with their powerful jaws fitted with sharp teeth, crocodiles and alligators sure look beautiful and nightmarish. But are they really the stuff of nightmares? Well, yes, especially if you get too close and personal. Welcome to Fierce's Reptile Marathon, a compendium of the most gruesome stories of crocodile and alligator attacks. Remember, if you find yourself in a swamp, just get out. It was a Saturday on June 7, 2014, when Bill Scott and his wife Rosalind headed out to Darwin, Australia, and made their way to Bill Dean Billabong. The Billabong, which is located on the South Alligator River system inside Kakadu National Park, was one of Bill's favorite places in the entire world. The man was nothing if not an enthusiastic fisherman. He'd been going to the Billabong for the past 20 years, often joined by his family. In fact, Bill would camp there 2 or 3 times a year, taking every opportunity to spend some quality time in that special place. The man loved anything that had to do with the outdoors and the landscape of the Northern Territory. He loved buying maps and planning trips to remote locations. He had decades of experience as a bushman, a fisherman, and a boater. That was his lifestyle, and he was well aware of both the dangers and the beauties of nature. Once Bill and Rosalind arrived at the Billabong, they were greeted by their son Aaron and his wife Joanne. Like his father, Aaron was also deeply devoted to the outdoors. He'd been going on trips into the wild ever since he was a kid, always an enthusiastic presence at his father's side. Both Bill and Aaron had their boats, and they were eager to get out on the water and start fishing amidst the beauty of Kakadu National Park. Kakadu National Park is a World Heritage Site with diverse landscape, flora, and fauna. Many plant and animal species in the park are rare, endangered, vulnerable, or endemic, perfectly adapted to their habitat. But there are some species that thrive inside the park, so much so that they are now considered a problem. It is the case of crocodiles, which have, over time, taken over the park's waterways. Crocodile hunting has been banned since 1972. Ever since, their number has skyrocketed, and some experts consider there to be an overpopulation. In fact, some even speculate crocodiles inside the Kakadu National Park are now as large and as numerous as before European settlement. Bill Scott knew there were crocodiles in the park. He never took unnecessary risks. Once he and his wife Rosalind arrived at the Bill Dean Billabong, they met up with Aaron, their son, and Joanne, their daughter-in-law. They had breakfast together, catching up. Then, at about 10 a.m., they put their boats in the water, ready to head out on the Billabong and start fishing. The family was cautious enough to look for crocodiles, but there were none in the water. Still, they knew to be careful near the edges of the water. Their small boats were perfect for navigating on the Billabong. They moved upstream for about 3 miles. Then Bill and his family started fishing. They weren't in a hurry. It was a Saturday morning, and they planned to camp in the park until Monday. The family spent the next 4 hours fishing and chatting, happy to take in the sun and be with each other. At about 2 p.m., they decided it was time to head back to the camp. Bill and his son moored their boats. Then Aaron and his wife Joanne left to go up the bank to fetch the 60-liter tank the family usually took camping. They needed to fill it and then let it sit in the sun, a simple procedure that would guarantee warm water for washing in the evening. Aaron entered the water up to his knees. He knew there were crocodiles, and he didn't want to risk his life. He was in and out in seconds, only filling half of the tank. The rest would have to be filled by the whole family, but in a seemingly safer manner. Aaron then carried the tank to a flat spot on the bank. Meanwhile, Bill was still in their own boat. He was at the back of his small boat. He took a bucket, leaned over the boat's edge, filled the bucket with water, and then passed the vessel to his wife, Rosalind, who was standing on the bank. Rosalind took the bucket and then handed it to Joanne further up the bank. Joanne finally handed it to Aaron, who poured the water inside the tank. It was teamwork. Everyone chipped in. After the second bucket, the tank was nearly full, and the family discussed whether a third bucket was needed or not. Rosalind decided to hand one of the buckets back to Bill and have him fill it, but the man never got the chance. Suddenly, the boat began to rock. At the same time, Rosalind noted a small ripple in the water. The harsh movement knocked Bill Scott off balance. Struggling to steady himself, 62-year-old Bill Scott put his hands out towards the back of the boat, and that's when it happened. A massive crocodile shot out of the water from behind the motor with an unexpected speed. The animal closed its huge jaws around Bill's left arm, shoulder, and chest. It was over in seconds. In an instant, the huge creature snatched Bill Scott from the boat and dragged him deep beneath the water's surface. Rosalind and Joanne watched in horror. Aaron, who had his back turned, thought he heard his father say something, but once he turned around toward his father, he only saw a splash. All of them started crying in terror. Aaron raced to the boat and started circling the area, hoping his father would somehow manage to free himself from the croc's mouth and swim back to the surface. In reality, there was nothing they could do to help the man. He was nowhere to be seen. The family started screaming louder. "Bill, if you could hear us, make a noise and we'll come find you," they called out. But there was no answer. Aaron then jumped into his boat, reversed it some 50 feet, stopped and looked around. Nothing. Then he spotted a ripple about 165 feet downstream. He chased it, but once again saw nothing. Aaron then hurried to a nearby resort to raise the alarm, leaving Rosalind and Joanne at the billabong. The women kept watch, and then they saw Bill's body floating to the surface, face down in the water. Rosalind tried to start the boat, but couldn't get it to start. Instead, she rowed it into the billabong, intent on retrieving her husband's body. But by the time Rosalind made it out, Bill's body had disappeared again, dragged beneath the surface by the powerful animal. Once Aaron returned with help, they resumed their search, but all efforts had to be ceased once it got dark. The search recommenced the following morning. Just before noon, Water Cop Wade Rogers shot a crocodile fitting the description of the one that took Bill. The crocodile measured 15 feet. It was indeed a huge creature. An autopsy was conducted at the location. As soon as rangers opened up the body, they were met with a gruesome sight. Bill Scott's remains were found inside the crocodile's stomach. Bill Scott's tragic fate sparked an inquest indicating that crocodiles have become familiar with humans and boats and generally have not developed the fear of humans that once existed when humans were also predators. This means crocodiles in the area are no longer afraid to snatch humans out of their boats. Of the 21 people killed by crocs in the Northern Territory since 1974, 4 died in 2014, the largest annual toll since records began. On March 16, 2009, 11-year-old Briony Goodsell, her younger sister, 7-year-old Bethany Goodsell, and her friend, Naomi Lang, were playing at home in Darwin's rural outskirts. It was a Sunday, and the girls were enjoying some free time, despite the weather. March is a moody month in the top end of the Northern Territory in Australia. It's the last month, at least officially, of the wet season, meaning there's always a possibility of floods and cyclones. The days are hot and humid, and thunderstorms are not at all uncommon. With such weather, exploring the outdoors can be a little tiring, but not when you're a kid and the whole world seems like a wonderful adventure. All 4 of them got on bikes, and then they started pedaling together. It was a good, honest day of fun. They weren't going too far from home, just somewhere they could swim. Briony and her friends called a creek crossing Black Jungle. They'd swum there before, so they knew the spot well. From their understanding and previous experience, there was nothing to be feared in those waters. The area was accessible to the public, or better said, part of it was accessible to the public, even young kids wanting to play in the water. The creek crossing was immediately adjacent to the Lambell's Lagoon access gate to the Black Jungle Conservation Reserve. Lambell's Lagoon is a mostly rural suburban area on the fringe of metropolitan Darwin, Australia. Briony Goodsell, her sister, and their friends were all part of the community's few hundred inhabitants. The Black Jungle Conservation Reserve, the designated place for their adventure on March 16, 2009, is a 10,000-acre protected area and part of the Adelaide River coastal floodplain. It's a wetland habitat supporting large numbers of wildlife. The reserve's open woodland savanna, its monsoon rainforest, and swamps provide rich habitats for numerous varied species, such as magpie geese, water pythons, and the terrifying saltwater crocodiles. To Briony and the rest of the children, the area was simply perfect for outdoor adventures. They usually swam in the creek when it filled with water during the wet season. On that Sunday, the kids initially swam near the access gate to the reserve, so not quite in the protected area. Each access gate was fitted with a sign indicating access by permit only. It wasn't unusual for rangers to deal with illegal entry by hunters. Some members of the public also used their vehicles to gain illegal entry to the reserve, most often than not by damaging gates and fences. As for permits, they were only granted for scientific research. Briony Goodsell, her sister Bethany, and their friends Naomi and Aidan swam for a while on the public side of the fence. But shortly after, they decided to go further downstream to another crossing, this one located inside the reserve. This new creek crossing had a deeper but less fast-flowing pool of water. In order to get to this spot, the four children had to go through a wire boundary fence and walk a short distance. Despite the reserve's reputation as a habitat for some dangerous species, there was no warning about the possibility of crocodile activity in the area. As the reserve rangers knew, there was plenty of crocodile activity within the reserve, especially in the wet season. But despite this, the rangers weren't aware that people were swimming at the reserve. After all, public access was strictly prohibited. This meant, at least in the rangers' perspective, that the chance of interaction between crocodiles and humans was low in the reserve. But people were swimming there. Shortly after the decision to swim elsewhere had been taken, the kids reached the creek crossing inside Black Jungle Reserve. The water levels were indeed high, the way they'd expected, but the creek was also flowing fast. Any adult might have hesitated to get into the water. Most likely, an adult wouldn't have entered the water at all. The conditions were perfect for drowning. But these were kids. The youngest of them was only 7 years old, the oldest only 12. Children aren't the best at assessing the potential dangers of a situation. And to make matters even worse, these particular kids had no idea there were crocs in the area. So instead of worrying about dying and turning around to leave, the group of four entered the water at about 5:30 p.m. They splashed around, swam, and played, happy to have some fun. But then everything changed in the blink of an eye. Suddenly, 11-year-old Briony Goodsell started to scream for help. The other kids turned toward the girl and saw she was starting to go under the water. At first, one of her friends thought Briony had a vine wrapped around her waist and she was struggling to free herself. But then the same friend saw the truth was far more terrifying. A crocodile tail came out of the water and then went right back in. "Crocodile!" their friend yelled, turning to look for the other children. When the kids looked back, Briony was gone. The children scrambled out of the water towards safety. Authorities were alerted. Police started looking for Briony. Human remains and a pair of shorts were found the following day, on Monday, over 1,400 feet from where the girl disappeared on Sunday. DNA tests confirmed the remains were indeed Briony's. Coroner Greg Kavanaugh confirmed the death was due to a crocodile attack. Even more, evidence suggested it was a saltwater crocodile of about 10 feet that attacked the little girl. Saltwater crocodiles are not only the largest living reptile, but they are also the most aggressive crocodile species. They are apex predators, preying on any living creature within their reach. The search for the crocodile responsible for the attack continued throughout Monday, but it was called off on Tuesday. The reasoning behind this decision was simple. Rangers believed the crocodile had headed back into a floodplain, which made the search impossible. Floodplains teem with crocodiles. There was no guarantee that authorities would be able to pinpoint the exact animal that killed Briony and Goodsell. An investigation found that residents in the area had no idea there were crocodiles in the creek. The only resident that seemed to be aware crocodiles could be in the creek had also swam in the exact same waters before. Briony's mother, Charlene O'Sullivan, believed the wording of the sign "access by permit only" was misleading. She argued that the kids might have believed the sign indicating that vehicles and hunting were indeed prohibited, but not entering the area by foot. Even more, signs indicating prohibited activities, such as swimming, were also added. And finally, all entry gates to the reserve were fitted with crocodile warning signs. While crocodile culling was discouraged, authorities reviewed and adjusted the saltwater crocodile management plan after Briony's death. The current crocodile management plan, prepared and approved by the Northern Territory government, promises the community that there will be increased attention to and efforts with regard to public safety, said Coroner Greg Kavanaugh. Briony's family asked to be left alone to grieve their huge loss. They released a statement calling Briony a beautiful, innocent, and fearless child that touched the lives of many. The family also called Briony's death a tragic accident. Their statement said, "Kids being kids don't always see possible dangers. No one is to blame for this tragedy. It is just one of those things." If you've been on the internet for a while, you've probably heard about Florida Man. The man, the myth, the meme. Internet users race to post the most unbelievable or strange news stories featuring men from Florida. But this Florida Man story might just take the cake. His is a tale full of grit, resilience, and perseverance, even amidst the most horrific circumstances. When modern man meets nature, chances are unforeseeable events will take place. And while we might have the upper hand with our machinery and technology, naked and afraid, we're usually no match for anything with scales, claws, or talons, and of course, massive jaws snapping for blood. But this man defeated all the odds when he chose to survive. It was July 17, 2022, when 43-year-old Eric Merda found himself with a little bit of free time on his hands. He was usually pretty busy with his irrigation and sprinkler company, but had just completed a job and decided to call it a day and head back to his home in Sarasota, Florida. As he drove in his white van, Eric spotted a dirt road. It intrigued him. He had never been on that particular road before, and he gave in to his more adventurous urges. He turned the wheel and took off down the dirt road, curious to see where it led. At some point during the afternoon, he got out of his van and continued his exploration by foot. He now knew where he was, or at least had the general idea of it. His exploration led him near the Manatee Fish Camp, a popular spot with fishermen and campers who wanted to enjoy the nearby Lake Manatee, an artificial reservoir completed in the 60s, which covers 2 square miles. Step by step, Eric Merda reached a swamp. While he was aware of many dangers a swamp poses to an unprepared traveler, from annoying insects carrying diseases to treacherous mud and dangerous animals, Eric wasn't about to give up. He was a Florida man, born and raised, and he had a good time, at least at first. The man enjoyed the feeling of the swamp, the rich sounds and earthy smells. He even liked the stingy feeling of getting cut up in the heavy brush. But as the day progressed, his feet hurt more and more. The cuts became more painful and annoying rather than a testament to Eric's adventure, and the heat was nothing short of unbearable. Merda also realized his water supply was getting scarcer, and he thought of his phone, which he had left in the van. He hadn't given it too much thought at first, but it seemed like a mistake now. He'd been walking for the better part of 3 hours, and it was easy to see it was time to get back to his van. If not for the fact that he didn't have any idea where he was, it was getting darker too. So Merda kept on walking, hoping to spot a familiar path or tree. Not much later, after resuming his search, he saw his van, but it was nowhere close. Instead, it was on the other side of the 2 square mile Lake Manatee. Like all Floridians, the 43-year-old man knew there were alligators in the swamp and that any body of water was potentially dangerous. In fact, gators have inhabited Florida's swamps, marshes, lakes, and rivers for many centuries. And sometimes they even go for strolls away from water and into residential areas, terrifying the local residents. But as he stood on the shore of Lake Manatee, Eric Merda was desperate. He was lost, confused, and the darkness began to engulf him. He thought he had no choice. He thought his best shot at getting out of the swamp and to his van was to plunge into the reservoir and swim for it. The muddy water did little to soothe his exhausted body and the million tiny cuts all over it, but Eric figured it wouldn't take him more than 15 minutes to cross what he thought was only half a mile of water. But the half mile came and passed, and Merda could feel he was in big trouble. His clothes were weighing him down, slowing the already tiresome advance through the water and causing the man to sink gradually. He took them all off, work boots, pants, long-sleeve shirt, and resumed his swimming naked. At least now Eric felt nimbler, but something got him on edge. The man wasn't sure what it was. He couldn't hear anything out of the ordinary, but it seemed to him that the very air he was breathing grew heavier and more tense. In an instant, Merda realized he was being watched. When he looked over, his blood froze in his veins. The beady, empty eyes of a huge alligator were closely watching him, really closely. The scaly beast was swimming parallel to him, merely 2 feet away from the man. Fight or flight initiated. The man turned to start swimming again, but as he raised his right arm, the alligator leapt on him and latched all of its 80 teeth on the outside of the man's right arm. Alligator teeth are not especially sharp, since they don't rip flesh off their prey, but their jaw muscles are massive, and they clamp down on their prey with full force. American alligators have a bite force of about 2,125 pounds per square inch. And this particular alligator wouldn't let go of Eric Merda, no matter the fact that the man started hitting it with his other arm and kicking at it with his legs. Instead, the creature pulled him under the water. The man fought back and resurfaced. Then the gator pulled him under 2 more times. When Merda made it back to the surface the 3rd time, the powerful beast employed its most feared tactic, the death roll. It yanked the man back underwater and attempted to spin him violently in an effort to drown and dismember him, and the creature was successful. Eric Merda's right arm snapped away between the elbow and shoulder, and the alligator swam away contentedly with the man's forearm and hand in his mouth. The man saw his bones sticking out, but he couldn't feel any pain yet. The shock was too powerful. He was confused and in pain. But he didn't want to lay down and die, so the man pushed through the pain and the unforgiving brush. He spotted a tree and pulled himself up and then spent the following couple of hours shouting and waving at every plane flying above, but no one heard him. Still, he didn't give up hope. He made a choice, and the choice was life. Walking through the thick brush wasn't an option anymore. It hurt Eric's exhausted body, and it hurt the exposed tissue on his severe wound even more. And he kept getting lost in the grass. It wasn't much of a decision to go back to the water. The 43-year-old knew he had to do it if he wanted to survive. The overgrown shoreline was also hard on his mangled body, and each time the thick vegetation touched him, the man would scream. Sometimes, when he raised his eyes, he could see an alligator watching. For the next 2 days, the man fought his way through the swamp. By the 4th day of the horrible ordeal, Merda's advancing through the underbrush was painfully slow. But at some point, he saw a sign of civilization, the most beautiful sight in the world, an old beer bottle dumped on the ground. That one beer bottle gave him enough strength to continue. The man was sure he'd reach someone soon, and he was right. Finally, he spotted a fence and a man walking toward a pickup. Eric started shouting, but his voice was probably too weak. The man didn't hear him. But Eric Merda was fed up with all these hardships. He started running, and the stunned man spotted him and stayed with him until the paramedics arrived in a helicopter and took the injured man to Sarasota Memorial Hospital. He was 15 pounds lighter and in dire need for antibiotics. Infection had eaten away at his wound, so doctors had to cut some more. But it didn't matter to Eric. He was alive, and he had fought an alligator for it. He went back home to his 7 children with a new outlook on life. Although his work in the irrigation field is no longer possible, Eric now hopes to become a motivational speaker. He thinks his encounter with death taught him important lessons that he'd like to share. Since his story made the news, there's been some rejection of Eric's version of the events, with members of the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission stating they'd found some inconsistencies in the man's various accounts of the story. Maybe the truth is still out there in the swamp. Hendri Coetzee was a big name in the adventure community. He was born in 1975 in South Africa, and in 2010, at 35 years old, Coetzee had already garnered quite the reputation for himself. Coetzee first gained recognition back in 2004 when he led a Nile River source-to-sea expedition. This first noteworthy expedition was inspired by John Goddard, the first person to navigate the entire length of the Nile River in a kayak. Coetzee's first expedition took 4 months, but it was a controversial one. Several claims that the expedition had not begun from the true source of the Nile determined Coetzee to prove his critics wrong. In April 2005, he commenced a second leg of the expedition, a further journey from Kagera to Lake Victoria. With over 4,600 miles completed, Coetzee's first expedition was finally over and a resounding success. It was December 7, 2010, and Hendri Coetzee was leading a groundbreaking whitewater kayaking expedition from the headwaters of the White Nile and Congo rivers into the Democratic Republic of the Congo. He was joined by 32-year-old Ben Stooksbury and 24-year-old Chris Corbulic, two world-class kayakers with extensive experience. Stooksbury and Corbulic were also dedicated explorers. With primary sponsorship from Eddie Bauer Incorporated's first ascent line of outdoor gear, the three men had started their trip a few weeks before. Their purpose was clear: document the whitewater of the White Nile and Congo and development projects in the region, bring attention to the horrible clean water crisis affecting millions in the region, and of course, be the first to boat the whitewater of the Lukuga River. Hendri Coetzee had a bit of an agenda himself. He wanted to show Stooksbury and Corbulic the beauties of the region. He wanted to take them from the snow-capped peaks into the deepest, darkest, steamiest jungle. And he wanted to show them Western media had it all wrong. This wasn't one of the most dangerous places on Earth. Instead, it was a place of immense beauty, with nice, hospitable people and breathtaking nature. The Lukuga is a tributary of the Lualaba River in the Democratic Republic of Congo, a largely unexplored river, teeming with wildlife. Hippos and crocodiles are a normal sight on the river, and Coetzee was very well aware of this. He had made sure to warn Stooksbury and Corbulic about the possible dangers of the expedition. Coetzee, who was familiar with the region, had instructed them to steer clear from eddies if they didn't want to encounter dangerous hippos wallowing underwater. Banks were also to be avoided because crocs would often sunbathe on them. Moreover, he taught his team to tap their boats to make noise. As a further precaution, the men decided to always paddle close together, in a formation that made them appear as a large animal to any potential predators. December 7, 2010 started out with a bit of an adventure on the Lukuga River. The three adventurers had just finished what was generally considered the unnavigable portion of the river. Nobody had ever made it across the portion in no sort of boat. Nobody except them. They had paddled more than 30 miles of whitewater. By then, Stooksbury and Corbulic were confident in their skills and more than used to their surroundings. The three little crocodiles they had seen on the water that day, all of them just 3 feet long, didn't scare the men. They were in formation, safe and victorious. After navigating the last stretch of the rapids, Coetzee, Stooksbury, and Corbulic faced 100 miles of flat water, a nice calm change of pace. They were in the middle of a stretch about 100 feet wide, paddling full pace in tight formation. There was thick elephant grass along the side, and the scenery was astounding. Coetzee was in the middle of the formation, with Stooksbury a little in front to his left, and Corbulic a little behind to his right. Every now and then, when they got out of sync, their paddle blades would touch. At one point, as they paddled, Corbulic glanced over to make sure they weren't paddling away or towards each other. That's when he saw it. It all happened in an instant. A huge crocodile, a terrifying creature, shot out of the water, opened its massive jaws, and clamped down on Hendri Coetzee's left shoulder. The animal's jaws were as big as the man's entire torso. There wasn't enough time to act. There wasn't enough time to do anything at all. Coetzee himself could do little else than shout, "Oh my God," before the animal pulled him under the water. His kayak was almost completely submerged. The overturned boat shook for about 20 seconds as the crocodile pulled Coetzee from the cockpit. Just like that, in the blink of an eye, Hendri Coetzee was gone, never to be seen again. Several dread-filled minutes passed. Stooksbury and Corbulic watched in silence, too stunned to move. Then the two men snapped out of their daze. They figured the animal could come back, and they knew there was nothing they could do to protect themselves if they just waited around. They had to get out of the river, and fast. The two men paddled about a mile downstream to a nearby village. As they were talking to the locals, trying their best to explain what happened, they saw Hendri's boat floating downstream. Stooksbury and Corbulic went after the kayak, just in case. But there was no sign to be found about Hendri's struggle. Once they returned to the village, the two men tried to convince the villagers to help them look for Hendri, but the villagers refused. They knew better. Hendri Coetzee was truly gone, and he wasn't the only one. This particular crocodile, a 15-foot, 2-ton beast, had already claimed the lives of 9 people. Ben Stooksbury and Chris Corbulic were devastated. They'd spent 7 weeks with Coetzee, and they both agreed this had been the strongest team they've ever been a part of. The men were evacuated by the International Rescue Committee, and now they had to make their peace. It was certainly one of the most terrifying, hurtful experiences of their lives, but at the same time, the expedition had been enlightening. Ben Stooksbury later recounted, "The unfortunate thing is the night before this happened was one of the most beautiful nights of my life. It had rained, and we were all pretty happy to get cooled off by the rain. We all huddled up under the tarp on a beach, and were all smiles and super happy with each other. We were overwhelmed by the place. To say that Croc came out of the blue is both literal and figurative. He took us at our happiest." The village where the two men stopped after the incident put out a small reward for any news or clues regarding Hendri Coetzee, but nothing was ever found, not even a small piece of clothing. A memorial service for Coetzee was held on 28 January 2011. The only things he had were books. He didn't even own a bicycle. He never left anything behind. Wherever he went, he just showed a bit of who he was. He was always so humble and never spoke about his expeditions or accolades or achievements. He was just Hendrik. He was such a special son, and I had such a special relationship with him. He was just awesome," said Marie Neiman, Hendri's mother. Hendri Coetzee is still remembered as one of the greatest river explorers in recent history.